The front door creaked open just as the sky outside began to pale. The house was still, the ceiling fan turning slow circles above the bedroom, the air thick with the last traces of night. Caroline Mitchell kept her body perfectly still beneath the quilt, her breathing even, her eyes closed as if she were deep in sleep. She had grown used to these hours. Her husband, Dr. Andrew Mitchell, often returned from long shifts at the hospital before sunrise. Sometimes he smelled of antiseptic, sometimes of coffee that had been sitting too long in the pot. Usually, Caroline rose to meet him, to ask how many patients he had saved, to warm leftovers in the oven. But not this morning. This morning, she waited, silent, every muscle alert. The hinges of their old bedroom door complained faintly as Andrew pushed it open, just far enough to look inside. He lingered in the doorway, watching the shape of her on the bed. "Lena!" he whispered, using the nickname only he had ever used. His voice was gentle, like the night itself speaking. Caroline did not answer. She kept her face turned toward the pillow as if lost in sleep. He closed the door, though the warped would never latched right. It drifted back an inch, leaving a thin shaft of light across the floorboards. From where she lay, she could see the glow of the hallway, could hear his footsteps fade and then stop. The next sound came low and urgent, the vibration of a phone. Then the click of a call answered. Caroline's heart jumped, each beat pressing hard into the mattress. She told herself not to move, not to breathe too loud. "I just got home," Andrew murmured, his voice hushed in a way that made the hair rise on the back of her neck. "How do you not understand? I can't come now." There was a pause, and though Caroline could not hear the words from the other end, she could hear the timbre, high like a girl's voice or perhaps a very young woman. "Don't be upset," Andrew pleaded softly. "You know how much I love you. I'll try later today, maybe tonight." Her chest tightened. She gripped the pillow beneath her hand, her nails pressing into the fabric. The word, love, landed heavy, like a stone in still water. For a moment, she tried to tell herself the reasonable things. Doctors often spoke gently to patients or to frightened families. He could have been reassuring someone desperate, someone who needed comfort at dawn. The hospital never slept. She had learned that long ago. But the tone, the tenderness in his words, was not professional. It was personal. Caroline felt the sting of tears press against her eyes, but she forced them back. She had lived her whole life by steadying herself, by holding the storm inside until it passed. She would not break now, not before she understood. The faint rush of water came from the bathroom as Andrew turned on the shower. She let out a shaky breath into the pillow, the cotton muffling the sound. Images flickered in her mind. The life they had built, the two boys asleep in their rooms down the hall, the years of laughter and exhaustion, the Sunday afternoons on the porch. Had all of it been nothing more than a stage for him to step away from whenever he wanted? The pipes groaned, then settled. The shower shut off. For a while there was only silence, the kind that seemed to stretch across the whole house. Finally, she heard him moving again, cabinet doors, the clink of a coffee mug, the scrape of the chair in the kitchen. He moved as though everything was normal, as though no cracks had opened in the dark. Caroline lay still, every sense awake. The ceiling above her blurred as her eyes burned, but she did not let the tears fall. She thought of her mother's voice, steady and stern, reminding her that Mitchell women did not collapse under pressure. She thought of the Savannah air outside, already heavy with the promise of heat, the moss hanging from the oaks like secrets. The world carried on, indifferent to the earthquake beginning in her chest. At last, she sat up, her feet touching the cool wooden floor. The house smelled faintly of coffee and the salt of early morning air drifting through the half-open window. Somewhere beyond the yard, a train whistle-moaned low, carrying across the marshland. It sounded lonely, but also certain, a line drawn through the silence. She walked to the hallway, careful not to let the floorboards creak. The pictures on the wall watched her. Ethan's school portrait with his too big smile, Ben's watercolor taped proudly to his door. They were the reason she would not scream, the reason she would hold herself together. In the kitchen, the clock glowed 6:05. Andrew's travel mug stood rinsed and drying beside the sink. A note lay on the counter in his neat handwriting. "Rounds this morning. Call you later." Caroline stood there, her hand pressed flat against the cool counter, the morning light spilling through the blinds in narrow stripes. Outside, the Spanish moss swayed in the faint breeze, silver green in the half-light. The beauty of Savannah at dawn had always calmed her, but today it felt like a backdrop too still, too quiet, a stage set for a play she had not agreed to perform. She swallowed hard, steadying herself. For the boys, she would keep the day moving. She would make their breakfast, pack their bags, and smile as if nothing had shifted. But deep inside, something had already cracked, and no matter how hard she pressed it down, she knew the truth would not stay hidden forever. The kettle clicked, steam rising. She poured water into a cup, watched the tea bloom dark against the porcelain. Her hand trembled only once before she stilled it. Caroline breathed long and slow, her eyes fixed on the light climbing the blinds. Savannah mornings always seeped in gently, but for her, this one carried a shadow that no sunlight could lift. Long before Caroline Mitchell had learned to hold secrets inside her chest, she had grown up with one secret whispered into her very beginning. She would always be an only child. Her parents, Samuel and Martha Green, had married young, as so many couples in rural Georgia did. Their home was a modest white farmhouse tucked at the edge of a pecan orchard just outside Savannah. The clapboard siding needed paint, and the porch sagged under years of summer heat and sudden storms. But to Martha, it was a castle, and to Samuel it was a promise, a place where laughter would echo and children's feet would run wild through the fields. Yet laughter didn't come easily. For years, the couple tried and failed to grow their family. Doctors in Savannah shook their heads gently, telling Martha nothing seemed to be wrong, only that sometimes the Lord takes his time. Friends from church prayed, neighbors offered remedies, and Martha carried her hope like a candle that flickered but would not go out. It was during those years of quiet longing that Martha visited Aunt Lucille, Samuel's grandmother. By then, Aunt Lucille was nearly blind, her hair a silver crown, her fingers always working yarn into shapes no one else could decipher. She lived in a small side room of the farmhouse, a woman so still she seemed to belong as much to the house as to the family. People in town said she saw things others couldn't, truths wrapped in shadows, the kind of knowing that came not from books, but from life itself. On a humid afternoon, when thunderclouds stacked like bruises on the horizon, Martha sat with her. "I don't think I can carry hope any longer," she whispered, her hands trembling around her teacup. Aunt Lucille reached across, her fingers thin but sure, finding Martha's wrist. "Child, don't let despair blind you. You will have one baby, a girl. She will be born under summer heat and grow with fire in her spirit. She will be your only one, but her life will not be small. She will carry a fate that belongs to no one else." Martha had stared, caught between wanting to believe and fearing to. "Only one?" she asked, her throat tight. "Only one," Aunt Lucille confirmed, her voice steady as if she spoke of weather, or of the tide that always returned. "But she will be enough, more than enough. She will be your comfort and your strength. She will be your pride." A year later, Caroline was born. The farmhouse filled with light when they carried her home from the hospital. Samuel held her up beneath the pecan trees and declared that the Lord had finally answered. Martha wept with relief, clutching her tiny daughter against her chest, promising to never forget the gift she had been given. As Caroline grew, she became the pulse of that household. With wide gray-blue eyes and a laugh that tumbled out like creek water, she carried warmth into every room. She toddled after Samuel as he worked the fields, her little shoes catching red clay. She perched on the counter while Martha baked biscuits, dusting her own cheeks with flour. The Greens had no riches, but lived by hard work and honest pride, and in that world Caroline was both treasure and torch. Still, the silence of siblings was a shadow that followed her. In Sunday school, she watched other children cluster in groups, brothers teasing sisters, sisters braiding younger siblings' hair. She often lingered at the edge, longing not for toys but for a hand smaller than her own to hold. When she asked her mother why she didn't have a brother or sister, Martha would smooth her hair and say, "Because God wanted you all to himself, sweetheart." Caroline smiled at the words, but inside she carried the ache of emptiness. On long summer evenings, when cicadas buzzed so loud it seemed the trees themselves were alive, she would lie in bed imagining a house full of noise, extra chairs at the table, extra shoes by the door, secrets whispered between siblings. She promised herself that one day, in her own home, there would never be silence like this. Despite the absence of siblings, Caroline proved resourceful. She learned to mend clothes by watching her mother, to plant seedlings by following Samuel's slow, steady hands. By the time she was 10, she could manage the small chores of the farm, gathering eggs, feeding chickens, shelling peas until her fingertips were stained green. Neighbors often remarked on her maturity. "That girl has an old soul," they said at church suppers, nodding as Caroline carried trays heavier than she was. Samuel would beam with pride, Martha would blush, and Caroline would simply shrug. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply doing what felt necessary. But in the quiet moments, late at night, when the lamp flickered and the house sighed around her, she remembered Aunt Lucille's words. She hadn't been there to hear them, of course, but Martha repeated the story often enough that it felt etched into Caroline's own memory, the prophecy of being the only one. She wondered what it meant, this talk of a special fate. Sometimes it felt like a blessing, other times like a burden. She didn't speak of it aloud. Instead, she let it shape a dream deep within her, that one day she would fill her life with the family she had never had. Not one child, not two, but many. A kitchen table so crowded you could barely set the plates. A home that never knew silence. Outside the farmhouse, the savannah air was always thick, pressing close, carrying the scent of earth and magnolia. The days were long, the work was hard, but Caroline's childhood unfolded beneath that sky with a resilience that seemed inevitable. She would run barefoot down the dirt lane, dust rising around her ankles, and even then, she carried a determination larger than her years. She was, after all, the child foretold, the only one, the girl with a fate whispered by a woman nearly blind, who saw more than sight could hold. And though Caroline didn't yet understand what path lay before her, the seed of longing for a big, noisy, unbreakable family was already rooted deep, waiting for its time to grow. When Caroline was 12, the rhythm of her family's life broke with the crack of wood and bone. Her father, Samuel Green, had gone out early to cut down an oak that had been leaning too close to the barn. He was strong and careful, a man who measured twice before lifting the axe. But the land has its own will. A storm weeks before had softened the soil, and when the tree fell, it twisted the wrong way. By the time the neighbors rushed over, Samuel lay pinned, his breath shallow, his eyes fixed on the sky that swayed through the branches. The ambulance came down the dirt road in a cloud of dust, its siren out of place against the quiet of the fields. Martha rode beside him, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles turned white. Caroline waited at the porch steps, her small fists clenched, praying the way she'd been taught in church, words running into one another, a plea to anyone who might listen. Doctors at the hospital in Savannah did everything they could. Samuel lived, but the diagnosis was final, a spinal cord injury that left him paralyzed from the waist down. He would never walk again. The news dropped into the Green household like a stone in deep water, sending ripples that never stopped. Samuel came home in a wheelchair, his eyes still full of quiet strength, But the weight of the farm now shifted onto Martha and Caroline. The fields did not wait for grief. Crops needed tending, animals needed feeding, fences needed mending. Martha rose before dawn and worked until her body ached, while Caroline shouldered tasks far beyond her years. She gathered eggs, milked the cow, hauled buckets of water that sloshed against her legs. She learned to handle the stubborn mule, to mend chicken wire with scraped fingers, to cook suppers hearty enough to keep them going. School became something she fit in between chores. She would rush home, sling her books onto the kitchen table, and tie her hair back before stepping out to the barn. Her teachers praised her diligence, but they never saw the dirt under her nails or the calluses forming on her palms. At night, when she finally sat with her homework, her eyelids fluttered, heavy with exhaustion. The neighbors tried to help. Some brought casseroles. Others offered to lend equipment or an extra set of hands during harvest. But no one could carry the burden forever. The farm was theirs, and survival depended on the greens alone. Caroline rarely complained. She watched her father's frustration, how his jaw tightened when he couldn't fix a hinge, how his hands trembled when he tried to lift something heavy. She loved him fiercely and hated his helplessness even more. She wanted to ease his shame, so she worked harder, smiled wider, and kept her worries tucked deep inside. The Savannah summers grew hotter each year, the air thick with humidity that clung to her skin. Caroline pushed through it, sweat dripping down her back as she hoed long rows of vegetables. She learned to move with the rhythm of the land, plant, water, harvest, repeat. Sometimes she felt older than her classmates, as if she carried decades instead of school books. Martha, once soft with hope, grew lean and wiry, her face lined with fatigue. But she and Caroline forged a silent partnership, mother and daughter bound by necessity. They split chores without words, moving around each other in the kitchen and fields, as if guided by instinct. Evenings brought little rest. After supper, Caroline helped her father into bed, adjusting pillows, bringing him water. He tried to hide his pain behind gentle jokes, teasing her about her messy braids or her quick temper. But when she left the room, she sometimes caught the edge of his despair, the slump of his shoulders when he thought no one was watching. One night, standing at the sink with soapy water up to her elbows, Caroline made herself a promise. She stared out the window at the dark fields and whispered into the glass, "When I'm grown, I'll make it better. I'll take care of them. And I'll have a family so big that no one ever feels alone." The words stuck to her ribs, a vow pressed into the marrow of who she was. Life pressed on. Seasons turned. Caroline grew stronger, her back straight and her arms muscled from work. She learned to navigate the delicate balance of caring for her father's needs and keeping the farm alive. Sometimes she envied her classmates, whose biggest worry was the next dance or baseball game. But then she'd see Martha's tired smile or Samuel's gratitude when she lifted something he couldn't, and she knew her path was different. Her childhood had ended the day that tree fell, but something else had begun, the forging of a will tougher than the red clay she walked on. Caroline became not just a daughter, but a partner in survival, a child who carried her family on shoulders that should still have been free to play. And though she longed for easier days, she never let herself forget the promise. One day, she told herself, she would leave behind the silence of being an only child. She would build a life filled with voices, laughter, and the kind of family she had always dreamed of, a family no accident could ever break. By the time Caroline turned 18, the Green Farm had taught her everything about resilience, but little about the world beyond Savannah's edges. While her classmates dreamed of leaving town for college or offices in Atlanta, she found herself drawn to the kitchen. Food had always been her language, baking biscuits beside her mother, carrying jars of preserved peaches down into the cellar, finding joy in small flavors that brightened hard days. So she applied to a culinary program in the city. It wasn't prestigious, but it was within reach, and more importantly, it allowed her to stay close enough to home to help. She took the bus into Savannah each morning, the air already damp with heat by the time she arrived. By afternoon, she worked long hours in a neighborhood restaurant, a brick building that smelled of grease and garlic, its tables full of regulars who left behind sticky coins and gossip. The kitchen was chaos, pots clanging, orders shouted, steam hissing from the flat-top grill. Caroline, slight but sturdy, slipped between cooks, carrying trays heavier than she looked capable of. Her fingers grew calloused, her arms strong. She learned quickly, earning nods from the head chef who rarely praised anyone. One evening, as the dinner rush surged, she hurried across the wet tile floor with a basket of plates. The sole of her shoe hit a slick patch, and the world seemed to vanish beneath her feet. She crashed down hard, pain shooting up her leg, the sound of shattering dishes ringing louder than the chatter of the dining room. "Don't move!" a voice called out, firm but calm. Caroline blinked against the blur of faces leaning over her. One figure knelt beside her, tall, with sharp features softened by concern. He wore a collared shirt beneath his white coat, his hospital badge clipped neatly to his chest. "I'm Dr. Andrew Mitchell," he introduced himself, his tone professional but warm. "Tell me where it hurts." Her ankle throbbed, but embarrassment burned hotter. "I'm fine," she muttered, trying to sit up. "Don't," he said gently, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "Let's check first." He moved with a calm authority that silenced the chaos around them. With practiced hands, he examined her leg, pressing lightly, asking questions. Caroline watched him, struck not only by his composure, but by the kindness in his eyes, a kindness she wasn't used to seeing from strangers. "It's a sprain, not a break," Andrew said after a moment. "But you'll need rest. Can someone cover your shift?" She laughed despite the pain. Rest isn't really an option. Something flickered across his face, curiosity mixed with admiration. Most people in Savannah seemed to take their hardships as complaints. She had spoken like someone used to carrying more than her share. Over the following weeks, Andrew appeared more often at the restaurant. Sometimes he came in with colleagues after long shifts. Other times he stopped by simply to check on her. Their conversations grew longer, first about food, then about life. Caroline found herself talking about the farm, about her parents, about the accident that had changed everything. Andrew listened closely, never dismissing the weight of her words. He asked about Samuel's condition, not out of politeness but genuine interest. One evening, after she admitted her father still struggled daily with pain, Andrew leaned forward. "Do you have his medical records?" he asked. Caroline hesitated. "Some. Why?" "I'm in neurosurgery residency," he explained. "One of my mentors, Professor Graham at Emory in Atlanta, is among the best in spinal procedures. If I could get the records to him, maybe he could offer an opinion. It's worth a try." The words struck Caroline like light breaking through clouds. For years, her family had accepted Samuel's wheelchair as permanent. No one had dared hope for more. Yet here was this young doctor, speaking with conviction that things could change. "You'd really do that?" she asked, her voice thin with disbelief. Andrew smiled, the kind that reached his eyes. "Of course. Your dad deserves the chance." In that moment, something shifted inside her. Gratitude tangled with admiration, and admiration edged toward something softer, deeper. She had spent so much of her life carrying others, rarely letting herself be carried. Andrew's presence felt like a hand reaching across the years of burden, steady and sure. When she brought the records to him, he treated them with reverence, flipping through pages as though each note carried weight. "I'll make sure they get to the right eyes," he promised. True to his word, weeks later the Greens received news. Samuel was a candidate for a corrective surgery. Hope, a fragile thing they had nearly buried, returned like spring after a long winter. For Caroline, trust was not easily given, but Andrew had planted it firmly, watering it with his steady words and his willingness to act. She found herself looking forward to their conversations, to the way his presence seemed to ease the sharp edges of her days. She didn't name it yet, this warmth growing inside her. But as she walked home beneath the oaks, the air heavy with the scent of magnolia, she thought of Aunt Lucille's prophecy. The old woman had said Caroline's life would not be small. Perhaps this, she wondered, was the beginning of what that meant. The morning of Samuel Green's surgery dawned heavy with nerves. The family had traveled up to Atlanta, where Emory University Hospital stood gleaming against the skyline. Caroline remembered the way her father's wheelchair bumped over the tiles, the antiseptic smell filling her lungs, the sterile lights humming overhead. For years, she had tried to accept his condition, to live with the sound of wheels where footsteps used to be. But now, for the first time, there was a door cracked open to something more. Andrew stayed close through the intake, speaking quietly with the nurses, reassuring Samuel with a calm steadiness. "They'll take good care of you," he told him. Samuel, pale but resolute, squeezed his daughter's hand. "We'll see what the Lord has in mind," he said. Hours later, when the surgeons finally emerged with tired smiles, Martha wept openly. "It went well," they announced. "He'll need rehabilitation, but he has every chance to walk again." Caroline thought her knees might give out. She pressed her face into her mother's shoulder, sobbing with relief. Andrew stood nearby, not gloating, not making himself the hero, but simply steady, the quiet presence that had opened the path toward this miracle. The recovery was grueling. Samuel spent months in therapy, each movement a mountain to climb. But with each passing week, he grew stronger, until the day finally came when he rose shakily from his chair, his hand braced against a walker, and took 3 uneven steps across the living room. The farmhouse erupted with joy. Martha clapped her hands, tears streaming down her face, and Caroline dropped to her knees in front of him, laughing through sobs. "Daddy, you're walking." From that day on, Andrew was no longer just the young doctor who had entered their lives by chance. To the Greens, he was a savior. Neighbors shook his hand at church potlucks, whispering that God had surely sent him. Samuel, never quick to give praise, said simply, "This man gave me my life back." But for Caroline, gratitude blossomed into something more. She found herself lingering on Andrew's visits, watching the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way he listened when she spoke as if every word mattered. She admired his dedication to medicine, but more than that, she admired his heart. Their courtship was not rushed. They walked together beneath the moss-draped oaks of Savannah, talking about the future, about the kind of home they wanted. Caroline told him about her dream of a large family, a house full of noise and love. Andrew smiled, saying he wanted the same. The proposal came simply. One evening, after dinner on the porch, Andrew reached for her hand. "Caroline," he said, his voice steady but soft, "I don't want to face a single day without you. Will you marry me?" Her answer was immediate, a tearful yes. The wedding was small, held in their church, the sanctuary filled with family and neighbors. Caroline wore a simple lace dress, her mother's veil pinned carefully in place. Samuel walked her down the aisle, each step slow but certain, his pride shining brighter than the sunlight spilling through the stained glass. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation erupted with cheers, and Caroline felt as though every dream she had ever whispered had taken shape. The early years of their marriage were painted in bright strokes. Caroline worked her way up in the restaurant kitchen, eventually becoming sous chef, commanding respect with her quick hands and sharp palate. Andrew buried himself in residency, long hours that stretched deep into the night, but he always returned to her with stories, some tragic, some triumphant, that reminded her of the fragility and resilience of life. Their home was modest, but full of warmth. On weekends, Andrew helped in the garden while Caroline tested new recipes. Laughter filled their rooms. And when silence came, it was the peaceful kind, the kind of silence built on trust. In time, the family grew. Ethan arrived first, red-faced and loud, filling their nights with sleepless wonder. Caroline rocked him in the small hours, singing lullabies her mother once sang to her, marveling at the weight of her own son against her chest. 2 years later came Ben, quieter, his tiny fingers curling instinctively around Andrew's. The house that once echoed with only Caroline's voice now rang with cries, giggles, and the endless shuffle of toys underfoot. She looked around their cluttered living room some evenings and thought, "This is what I dreamed of. This is what Aunt Lucille never said. That even if I was an only child, I would never be alone once I built my own home." For a time, life felt charmed. Caroline balanced motherhood and her work in the kitchen, where colleagues admired her energy. Andrew climbed quickly in his field, respected by peers and adored by patients. Together, they seemed unstoppable. They weren't rich, but they were happy. Every milestone, the boys' first steps, the first Christmas tree they decorated as a family, the porch swing Andrew installed for her, seemed to confirm that their love had taken root in something solid. In those years, Caroline trusted without question. She never doubted the man who had given her father back his legs, who had given her children, who had filled her life with joy. She believed their story was unshakable, that the vow she made in white lace would carry them through every storm. She could not yet see the shadow on the horizon, the faint crack forming beneath the surface of their perfect picture. For now, she only knew the sweetness of dreams fulfilled, the miracle of a marriage that felt like destiny. By the time Ethan was in preschool and Ben had learned to toddle after him, Caroline felt that her life had finally taken the shape she had dreamed of. The days were long but full. Early mornings at the restaurant, afternoons balancing nap schedules and errands, evenings waiting for Andrew's late return. Their house in Savannah pulsed with the rhythm of work, love, and routine. Yet, even in those busy days, small shadows sometimes crept in. They came not from Andrew himself, but from whispers that drifted through the kitchens and locker rooms of the hospital world. Stories of lives fractured in places where long hours and exhaustion left cracks for temptation to slip through. One afternoon, Caroline sat at a cafe table with Hannah, a fellow cook who had become both colleague and friend. Hannah's eyes were red-rimmed, her hands trembling around a coffee cup. "He cheated," she said flatly, her voice scraping against the noise of traffic outside. "My fiancé. I thought I knew him, thought I could trust him. Turns out he'd been seeing a nurse for months. I only found out because she left her bracelet in his car." Caroline reached across the table, squeezing her friend's hand. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her stomach tightening as though the betrayal had struck her own chest. "They're all the same," Hannah spat bitterly. "Doctors, I mean. Always at the hospital, always surrounded by young women, always too tired to resist the attention. It's like they think the rules don't apply to them." Caroline shook her head. Not all of them. But Hannah's words clung. That night, as she rocked Ben back to sleep, Caroline heard them again in her mind. They're all the same. She thought of Andrew's long shifts, the calls that came at odd hours, the way he sometimes returned home with his tie loosened, too weary to speak. She remembered the soft tone he used on the phone with patients' families, the tenderness that could sound so much like intimacy. Caroline shook it off, scolding herself for even imagining it. Andrew wasn't like that. He had saved her father, had carried her through every burden. He was loyal, dependable, the man who still scribbled notes on the counter reminding her to eat, to rest, to take care of herself. But Hannah's story had cracked something. For the first time, doubt had a foothold. One night the crack widened. Caroline lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan's slow circles, the moonlight spilling in through the blinds. Andrew was still at the hospital, performing an emergency surgery. She trusted his explanation. She always had, but tonight her mind betrayed her. She pictured him not in the operating room, but standing in some quiet corridor, laughing softly with a woman whose face she couldn't see. She imagined whispered conversations, the kind of tenderness meant only for her, given to someone else. The images felt so vivid that her chest ached. She pressed a pillow over her face to stifle a sob, furious with herself for even thinking it. She loved Andrew. He had never given her reason to doubt him. But the whisper of possibility had already burrowed too deep. By dawn, her eyes burned with exhaustion. She rose early to start breakfast, moving slowly through the motions of whisking eggs, setting plates, packing Ethan's bag for school. She forced a smile for the boys, though her heart felt heavy. The front door opened, and Andrew stepped inside, his hair damp from a quick shower at the hospital, his tie freshly knotted. In his hands, he carried a bouquet of lilies, her favorite, their pale petals still wet with dew. "Happy anniversary," he said, his smile gentle, his voice filled with warmth. Caroline blinked, the ache in her chest loosening just slightly. She had forgotten the date, too wrapped in her restless night. He kissed her cheek, set the flowers on the counter, and began making coffee as if nothing in the world could disturb their peace. She laughed softly, embarrassed. "I can't believe I forgot." "That's why you have me," he teased, handing her a mug. His eyes were steady, untroubled, filled with the same devotion she had always seen there. For a moment, Caroline felt foolish. How could she have doubted him? She leaned into his touch, breathing in the familiar scent of soap and coffee, willing herself to believe that Hannah's pain had nothing to do with her own life. But as she arranged the flowers in a vase, she noticed her hands trembling. The doubt had not left. It had only quieted, curling into a corner of her heart. A fine fracture had formed in the trust she once believed unbreakable. And though she buried it beneath smiles and daily routines, she sensed it would never fully disappear. The morning sun had barely touched the moss-draped oaks when Ethan tiptoed into the kitchen, his hair sticking up in wild tufts. "Mom, is it ready?" he whispered, his eyes bright with excitement. Ben stumbled in after him, clutching a handmade card colored with crooked balloons. Caroline hushed them both with a smile, setting the final candle into the small chocolate cake she had baked the night before. It wasn't elaborate, just a simple round cake with the boys' favorite sprinkles scattered on top. But to them, it was magic. Today was their father's birthday, and they had planned a surprise. The boys giggled as they practiced whispering "Happy Birthday" in unison. Caroline kissed the top of their heads, her heart swelling with their innocence. She told herself this was how life was meant to be, sweet, ordinary, stitched together by small joys. Then she heard it. From down the hallway came Andrew's voice, low and intimate, carried through the half-closed bedroom door. She froze, the knife still in her hand. "Yes, sweetheart, I'll come later," he murmured, his tone soft in a way that didn't belong to hospital rounds or patient updates. "I promise. After dinner. Just wait for me." Caroline's stomach clenched. She felt the blood rush to her ears, the sound of his words echoing as if the house itself wanted her to hear. She could not mistake it, the tenderness, the promise, the kind of intimacy meant only for her. The boys tugged at her sleeve, oblivious. "Mom, can we bring the cake now?" Ethan asked eagerly. She swallowed hard, forcing her lips into a smile. "Yes, let's surprise Daddy." Together, they pushed the kitchen door open, carrying the cake alight with flickering candles. Andrew stood there in the hallway, phone lowered quickly, his smile broad as if nothing had happened. "What's this?" he exclaimed, letting the boys swarm him with hugs. Caroline kept her face steady, her voice bright as she joined the chorus of "Happy Birthday." She clapped, she laughed, she leaned forward so Andrew could blow out the candles. But inside, something had cracked. All day, she played her part. She helped the boys wrap their small gifts, a drawing from Ben, a toy car Ethan insisted his father would love. She cooked Andrew's favorite dinner, fried chicken with mashed potatoes, the scent filling the house like comfort itself. She poured sweet tea into glasses, smiled as the boys chattered about school, and laughed at Andrew's stories. But every time she looked at him, she heard the whisper in the hallway, "I'll come later. Just wait for me." Her heart fractured, but she hid it well. For the children's sake, she kept the illusion intact. She knew they would remember this day, the cake, the laughter, the way their father lifted them high into the air. She would not let her pain stain their memory. Night fell, and the house grew quiet. The boys finally drifted to sleep, their small breaths rising and falling in unison. Caroline stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty plates and half-melted candles. Her reflection in the window looked unfamiliar, her eyes too hollow, her mouth too tight. Andrew entered, his expression calm, his voice light. "That was a good day, wasn't it?" She turned to face him, her throat raw from holding in the truth. "I heard you," she said flatly. He blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "This morning. On the phone. I heard everything." For a moment, silence pressed between them, thick and suffocating. Andrew's jaw tightened. "Caroline, don't lie," she cut in, her voice sharp, colder than she had ever heard herself sound. "You said you'd come later. You promised her." He looked at her then, the mask slipping. For years, he had been steady, the man she trusted more than anyone. Now she saw the hesitation, the fracture of guilt. "I didn't want to hurt you," he admitted finally, his voice low. Caroline felt the air leave her lungs. The words landed harder than any denial could have. She had hoped, even in her fury, that he would laugh it off, explain it away as a misunderstanding. But the truth was right there in his eyes. Her chest constricted, the weight of betrayal pressing down until she could barely breathe. "After everything," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Andrew reached for her, but she stepped back. The distance between them felt wider than the whole of their house, wider than the years they had built together. In that moment, Caroline knew the life she thought unshakable had been built on fragile ground. The birthday that had begun with laughter ended in silence, so heavy it could split the walls. They drove in silence, Savannah sliding past the windows in a blur of live oaks and sagging porches, the dusk light turning brick and moss the color of old coins. Caroline watched the city she knew by heart become unfamiliar mile by mile, as if the streets themselves refused to say what waited at the end of them. Andrew's hands were steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed ahead. He did not try to take her hand. He did not turn on the radio. The car filled with the sound of tires on patched asphalt and the soft, unsteady rhythm of two people breathing the same air for different reasons. He turned into a neighborhood of aging apartment blocks set back from the road, their stucco fronts sun-faded and quilted with ivy. A rusted swing creaked in the small courtyard. Laundry lines dipped low between balconies. Somewhere a dog barked and then gave up. Caroline took it all in with a kind of numb clarity. The details people remember on the day their life swerves. The way a puddle kept the shape of last week's rain. The way a porch bulb flickered, unwilling to die or burn bright. Andrew parked and cut the engine. Evening held. "Please," he said, his voice scraped thin. "Come up with me." Caroline stared at the building. "If you're bringing me to see her," she said, surprising herself with how even she sounded, "I'm already here." They climbed a narrow staircase that smelled faintly of bleach and fried onions. On the second-floor landing, he stopped at a door with peeling paint, lifted his hand to knock, then lowered it and used a key. The lock yielded with a tired click. Inside, the apartment was small and carefully kept. A couch with a crocheted throw, a shelf of paperbacks, a framed school photo on the end table. Dark hair, wary eyes, the kind of smile children give when asked to be brave. Caroline stood just inside the threshold, every muscle coiled, as footsteps padded down a short hall. A girl appeared, 13 maybe, lean, straight-backed, her hair pulled into a ponytail that had started the day neat and now escaped in soft wisps. She wore a faded t-shirt and jeans too short at the ankle, and she looked first at Andrew, then at Caroline, alarm and hope meeting in the middle. "Grace," Andrew said, and his voice broke on the single syllable like a wave splitting on stone. This is Caroline." The girl's eyes flicked again to Caroline, hungry to be told what kind of person she was, what kind of moment this would be. Caroline's breath faltered. The word he had used that morning, "sweetheart," echoed in the small room, rearranging itself into a shape that fit this child's face. Relief and disbelief struck at the same time, canceling each other out. She had spent all day bracing herself for one kind of betrayal, and now stood in front of another entirely. Not a lover, a daughter. A figure moved from the hallway behind the girl. An older woman, small but sturdy, her gray hair swept back and her mouth set in a line that had learned to hold. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and gave Caroline a careful nod. "I'm Vera," she said. "Her grandmother. Can I get you some tea?" Caroline couldn't find her voice. She shook her head, then remembered her manners and whispered, "Thank you." She stood there, aware of her own hands, of their uselessness. Andrew's fingers curled and uncurled at his sides. "May we sit?" he asked. Vera gestured to the couch. Grace stayed near the hall for a beat, as if measuring the distance between where she was and where she might belong, then crossed to an armchair and perched at the edge, her knees together, her chin lifted with a courage that looked rehearsed. Andrew sat on the far cushion, leaving space between himself and Caroline that felt like a confession. He looked at the girl, then at Vera, then finally at his wife. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "I should have told you before any of this could hurt you." Caroline clasped her hands, so she wouldn't reach for anything that wasn't there. "Who is she?" she asked, though the answer had already written itself into the room. "My daughter," he said, the word simple and devastating. "Her name is Grace." The air shifted. A clock ticked somewhere out of sight, steady and indifferent. Caroline heard her own heartbeat in her ears, loud and implausible, as if her body were surprised to still be alive. "How long?" she asked. 13 years, he said. "I didn't know about her until she was 8. Her mother and it was before you and I met. It was brief. We weren't right for each other. We ended it, and I left town for my residency. She never told me. Not then." He swallowed hard. "When Grace's mother got sick, cancer, she called Vera. Vera called me. I came." Vera's hands were folded over the dish towel now, white-knuckled despite her calm voice. "My daughter was proud," she said. "Proud and foolish sometimes. She thought she could do it alone. By the time she allowed help, time wasn't on her side." Caroline turned to the girl, who had not taken her eyes off Andrew, as if he might vanish if she blinked. "How long?" she tried again. "How long have you lived here?" "Since I was little," Grace said, her voice too old in the way children's voices become when they've had to hold grown-up words. "Mama died 5 years ago." She glanced at Vera. "Grandma took me in." She tipped her chin toward Andrew. "He helps." "I pay the rent," Andrew said quickly, shame and love tightening his jaw. "Groceries, school things, anything she needs. I come by when I can. I've missed too much. They've allowed me to be something." He glanced at Grace and smiled with a tenderness Caroline had once thought she alone knew. "We study science on Saturdays when I'm off. She's better at it than I was." Grace's mouth twitched toward a smile. "He says that every time I beat him at math," she said, the line practice but true. The room swam for Caroline, as if the floor had shifted under her feet in the same impossible way it had years ago when the tree fell on her father. Secrets changed gravity. Her mind tried to order facts. Before her, after her, known, unknown. She found the edges of a question and held it like a railing. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was a coward," Andrew said, not reaching for excuses. "At first I didn't know how. Then I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. Grace was grieving. You were pregnant with Ethan. Then Ben came. And then it was always the wrong moment, and the wrong moment stretched into years. I told myself I was protecting you. I told myself I was protecting her. But the truth is, I was protecting myself from losing everything at once." Caroline stared at her hands. The skin across her knuckles was pale, bloodless. She thought of their wedding day, of Samuel holding himself upright to walk her down the aisle, of vows spoken in a church that smelled of lemon oil and certainty. She thought of anniversaries, of the lilies on the counter that morning not so long ago, of her boys drawing birthday balloons. A life lived right beside this other life, stacked like two plates that never quite sit flush, always a hairline gap ready to pinch. "You let me think it was an affair," she said quietly, surprised to hear the accusation, softened by sorrow more than rage. "You let me become the kind of wife who suspects, when the truth was this. I didn't know how to bring these worlds together without breaking them," he said. "I should have trusted you. I should have trusted who we are." Vera stood, unable to remain still any longer, and crossed to the small kitchen, returning with 3 glasses of water that sweated in the warm air. She set them on the coffee table and kept her hand lightly on Grace's shoulder as if to anchor her. "I asked him if you knew," she said to Caroline. "Many times. He said he'd tell you soon. I suppose soon is a word that can stretch until it snaps." Grace's eyes darted between the adults, taking in each word like a sentence being written for her. She tried to look brave and looked, instead, like a child who had learned too early to be careful with hope. Caroline leaned forward. "Grace," she said, tasting the name, tasting its simplicity and its gravity. "What do you want?" The question surprised even herself. Across all the roaring inside her, something quiet demanded to hear this one small truth from the person at the center of it. Grace studied her laces. When she spoke, her voice wavered. "I want to do good in school. I want Grandma to stop worrying so much. I want," she glanced at Andrew as if asking permission, then lifted her chin. "I want to know my dad without making anybody hate me." The sentence took the air out of the room. Andrew bowed his head. Caroline pressed her fist to her mouth and closed her eyes because there it was, the blade and the bomb in the same breath. This wasn't a scandal. It was a life, a child, a map of love drawn badly and followed poorly, but love all the same. When she opened her eyes, the room hadn't changed, but the way she stood in it had. Pain surged through her, sharp, clean, a cut she could name now that it had stopped hiding. She wasn't ready to forgive. She wasn't ready to know what came next. But she could see that there had never been a version of the story where she remained untouched. "You should have told me," she said to Andrew, "because some things must be said aloud. You should have trusted me with the truth the way I trusted you with my whole life." "I know," he whispered. "I am so sorry." The apology hung there, insufficient and necessary. Caroline let it be what it was. Not a cure, not even a bandage. Just a word placed carefully on an open wound. Outside, night thickened. A car passed, its headlights tossing brief, light across the ceiling like a river in moonrise. In the corner, the clock chimed the hour, small and determined. Caroline stood. Her legs held. "I need air," she said. "I need time." Grace rose too, reflex more than decision, then sat again when Vera's hand applied the slightest pressure. Caroline looked at the girl, really looked, past the blur of shock to the specific. The line of her jaw like Andrew's, the stubborn curve of her mouth that could have been her mother's, the narrowness of her shoulders under a t-shirt that had been washed 100 times. "I'm not angry with you," she said, and watched relief move through the childlike breath. "This isn't your fault." Grace nodded, blinking fast. Caroline turned to Vera. "Thank you for caring for her," she said. "I would do it again," Vera replied. "But a child needs more than one kind of love if she can get it." On the landing, the air felt cooler. Andrew followed, stopping at the door as if unsure whether he had the right to step closer. Caroline placed her palm against the rough paint, grounding herself in the ordinary texture of wood and wear. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," she said, eyes on the stairwell where someone had set a pot of geraniums. "I only know that what I thought was true this morning isn't the same now. The hurt is different, deeper maybe. but not the kind I thought. I understand, he said, and for once did not reach for her, as if understanding meant learning to let the space exist without trying to fill it with easy words. She drew a breath that didn't steady her and began down the stairs, one hand on the rail. At the bottom, she paused and looked back. We will have to find a way to tell the boys, she said, and we will have to find a way to live with this truth. But tonight I need to go home. Andrew nodded, accepting the sentence. I'll drive you. She nodded once. Behind them, somewhere above, a door closed softly, and the sound felt like a seal on a chapter that had been written long before she ever knew it existed. They stepped out into Savannah's night, the air warm and damp, the city humming with its own old secrets. Caroline walked to the car beside the man she loved, carrying a new grief and the outline of a child's name, both heavier and somehow more honest than the lie she had been holding all day. The drive back to their neighborhood was heavy with silence, broken only by the hum of tires on asphalt and the distant chorus of crickets rising with the night. Streetlights cast fleeting patterns across Caroline's face, showing the weariness in her eyes, the tight line of her mouth. Andrew kept both hands on the wheel, his knuckles pale, as though steering the car was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. At last his voice came, low and uneven. I should have told you from the beginning. I told myself I was protecting you, protecting us, but the truth is I was terrified. I didn't want to lose you. I didn't want to lose the family we built. Caroline turned her gaze to the window, watching the blurred lights slip by. And so you built two families instead. One in the daylight with me, one hidden in the shadows. Did you really think you could keep them apart forever? No, he admitted. Every day I felt the weight of it pressing down. But each time I thought about telling you, I saw our boys' faces. I saw how happy we were, and I was afraid one truth would destroy it all. The words struck deep. Caroline clenched her jaw, torn between fury and sorrow. She imagined their wedding day, the laughter of their sons, the lilies he brought her on anniversaries, all of it standing on a foundation she had not known was cracked. And yet, she also remembered the girl's face in that apartment, the way Grace had looked at her father with both hope and fear. That was no lie. That was flesh and blood. Do you love her? Caroline asked suddenly, her voice sharp in the dark. Andrew jerked his eyes from the road, startled. She's my daughter. That's not what I meant, she pressed. Do you love her mother? Did you ever? He shook his head, quick, desperate. No, it was a brief mistake before I knew you. It ended almost as soon as it began. I never loved her. I have only ever loved you. Caroline leaned back, closing her eyes. The ache inside her shifted, not gone, not soothed, but less jagged. The truth of Grace's existence cut deep, but it was not the kind of betrayal she had feared. It was different, a past hidden away, a mistake that had grown into a life. For days afterward, the question of what to do hung over her like a storm cloud. She lay awake at night beside Andrew, wondering if their marriage could survive, if forgiveness was possible, or if the lie was too large to bridge. She pictured her boys growing up, discovering one day that they had a sister they'd never known. She pictured herself walking away, starting over, raising Ethan and Ben alone. Both images broke her heart. But the one that lingered most was Grace, 13 years old, braver than a child should be, whispering that all she wanted was to know her father without making anyone hate her. Those words replayed in Caroline's mind, tugging at something deep inside her that had been waiting since she was a little girl. The longing for a sister, for family that was never just one. The decision came slowly, but when it did, it felt like a door opening. Caroline drove back to that apartment one afternoon alone. Grace answered the door, startled, her wide eyes searching Caroline's face for signs of anger. Instead, Caroline knelt and opened her arms. Grace hesitated, then stepped forward, and Caroline wrapped her tightly, fiercely, the way a mother holds a child she's claimed as her own. In that embrace, something shifted. The wound did not heal instantly, but the sharp edges dulled, replaced by a fragile, trembling hope. From then on, the Mitchell household began to change. Grace visited often at first, weekends and holidays, the boys slowly adjusting to the idea of a sister. There were awkward moments, bursts of jealousy, questions that made Caroline's heart clench. But there was also laughter, the kind that bounced between rooms, the kind that made their once ordinary house feel like it had grown another heartbeat. Eventually, the family made a bigger decision. They moved into a larger home on the outskirts of Savannah, a 2-story house with wide windows and enough bedrooms for each child to have their own. On moving day, the children raced through the empty halls, their voices echoing against bare walls, claiming corners and closets as their own kingdoms. Caroline stood in the doorway of what would become Grace's room, watching the girl trace her fingers over the windowsill as though marking the space into her memory. Tears stung Caroline's eyes. For so long, she had dreamed of a daughter, of a house filled with more than just the voices of her sons. She had never imagined it would come like this, but sometimes life delivered blessings wrapped in jagged paper. That night, when the boxes were stacked and the house smelled of fresh paint and exhaustion, Caroline stepped out onto the porch. The Georgia air was thick and sweet, cicadas buzzing in the distance. Andrew joined her, his hand hovering uncertainly at her back. She let him rest it there. "Do you really forgive me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Caroline stared out at the shadows stretching across their new yard. "Forgiveness isn't a single moment, Andrew. It's a choice I'll have to make every day. Some days will be harder than others. But I know this much. I don't want to tear apart what we have, not when it can become something stronger." He exhaled, the sound of a man who had been holding his breath for years. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving I deserve that choice." She didn't answer with words, only slipped her hand into his. For the first time in weeks, the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a truce. As the days turned into months, the Mitchell family grew into its new shape. The boys learned to look for their sister's laughter. Grace learned to trust the love that had finally reached her, and Caroline learned that healing did not erase scars. It built new strength around them. One evening, as she tucked the children into bed, Ethan mumbled sleepily, "I like having a sister. It makes us bigger." Caroline smiled, smoothing his hair. "Yes, sweetheart, bigger and stronger." Later, she stood in the hallway, the doors to 3 bedrooms closed, each one holding a piece of her dream. She thought of Aunt Lucille's prophecy, of the words spoken in that farmhouse years ago, the only one but not a small life. Now she understood. She had been an only child, but her life had expanded into something vast, messy, complicated, and beautiful. She had a daughter, not by birth, but by choice, and in that choice lay a kind of destiny. As she turned out the lights and joined Andrew on the porch, she breathed in the warm Savannah night and let herself feel both the ache of the past and the fragile joy of the present. The road ahead would not be simple, but it would be theirs. Her dream had come true, not in the way she imagined, but in the way life often gives. Unexpected, imperfect, yet undeniably real. And in that truth, Caroline found peace.